First off, I want to welcome everyone to Conversation Club, and we will be speaking with Evert Hopman, who is our guest, who will be interviewed by our moderator, Virginia Woolf. So this is about her book, The Real Witches of New England. And Conversation Club is something that we started last year, and it endeavors to make new ideas and perspectives accessible and to spark lively conversation by using history as a basis to engage and frame meaningful dialogue, learning, and reflection by re-examining the past and helping us to envision the future. Our club is based on the Conversation Club, originally formed in Farmington in 1818. And this is when folks gathered to discuss the leading issues of the day. And I'm so happy to resurrect this program. I wanted to say a little bit about the Mary Barnes Society, which will be, I'm sure Virginia will speak about as well, but the Mary Barnes Society at Stanley-Whitman House is dedicated to supporting the study of the Connecticut witch trials with the goal of a deeper understanding of the people and cultures of this seminal time in history. Named for Mary Barnes, a Farmington woman who was executed for witchcraft on January 25th, 1663. This year, 2022, the Society will mark the 359th anniversary of Mary Barnes' hanging by offering a variety of programs in person or as Zoom webinars, all of which will include a question and answer session to follow. So there's more information on our website. I sent out an email with some links. And again, I want to welcome you. My name is Andy Versosa, Executive Director of the Stanley-Whitman House. And I've said it many times to our moderator and our guest, I'm so pleased to have you here, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Andy. Delighted to be here. It was fun in meeting Ellen for doing this panel, finding a like-minded person interested in the history of witchcraft, although we come at it from very, very different angles. And one might ask, why now? Why January? And I just wanted to repeat what Andy said, which is January marks the month that the last hangings for witchcraft were done here in Connecticut. Certainly we know that Salem happened in 1692, ours are in 1663. But Ellen Evert Hopman is a prolific author, to say the least. She has written a number of books on mystical plants, on the history of witchcraft. She herself is a druid, and we're going to get into more of that as we get into the program. But she's the audio tapes on paganism and Druidry. She's written many novels and lots of books that are coming up. So welcome, Ellen. We've had a fun time chatting up until now. We thought that it's not fair to talk about witchcraft in the modern era without giving you an idea of the history. So we're going to take you back very, very briefly to where this all began. Where did witchcraft come from, the history of it, before people even came here to New England? And Ellen is an expert on that versus myself. So Ellen, take us through a little timeline.
Well, I'm going to talk about the timeline of the persecutions. I mean, witchcraft, I'm sure, goes back to the Paleolithic and earlier, as a craft. I'm sure people were honoring the sun and moon and deities of one kind or another and making offerings. And we know that they buried people with practices, But as far as the persecutions, we can only go as far back as the literature, and the earliest literature that we have is Bronze Age writings, and so we can go back to that. And this is a huge subject, so I tried really hard to just make a thumbnail, which is difficult. But first of all, there's one thing I want to start with. I just want to say that you hear the figure 9 million witches were killed. You hear that a lot in certain circles. The highest number that there's any evidence for, the highest possible number, is 300,000, but most people think it was between 40 and 60,000 in the entire witch persecution. Okay, so I just want to get that out of the way. So the first written evidence that we have is the Old Testament, And there's a phrase that people read in the King James Bible, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. That was not in there until King James. King James was terrified of witches. That's how that got in there. That's not what it says in the Hebrew. It says whisperers, and that's because old women muttered a lot. One who whispers a spell, or a woman who has spoken spells to harm others, or possibly a poisoner. In other words, we don't really know what the word means, but it never says which. Okay, so that was around 1400 BCE. All right, so we're talking there. Moving right along. I mean, you can look in the Bible. There's a bunch of quotes in the Bible that are relevant. My favorite ones, there's one: the children gather wood and the fathers kindle the fire, and the women knead the dough to make cakes to the Queen of Heaven and to pour out drink offerings unto other gods, that they may provoke me to anger. So that's Yahweh getting upset because people are making offerings to the Queen of Heaven. That's Jeremiah 7:18. Jeremiah 44:19. And said the women, when we were burning sacrifices to the Queen of Heaven and were pouring out libations to her, was it without our husbands that we made for her sacrificial cakes in her image and poured out libations to her? Anyway, there's evidence in the Bible of goddess worship and so on. That's in the Hebrew Bible, goddesses. Okay. Then moving to the 1st century. So what happened with the goddess thing? Witches are very goddess oriented. So in the 1st century CE or AD, now you had a monotheist, high temple Hebrew religion that was patriarchal, and that was a new thing. So they started to banish all the gods and goddesses because they wanted the franchise, basically. Then in the 4th century, I'm skipping along here, 4th century, St. Augustine of Hippo, by now we had Christians, he said that only the monotheist God could control nature, so it was impossible for witches to have any power. And since witches were powerless, the church had no reason to persecute them. So there was no persecution, and that's kind of nice. All right. Then in the year 1,600 years later, if you all remember Y2K, when we were supposed to be terrified because all the computers were supposed to, go nuts, and there was total panic and people were hoarding food, and, because the calendar was changing. Same thing happened in the year 1000. They had a 1K panic. All right. So, at that point is when the devil gets invented, because everybody's terrified. The calendar is changing. We got to be scared. So who do we blame? And they started to talk about the devil for the first time. So it took 1,000 years for that all to happen. And it wasn't until the year 1200 that the devil appears in art, in Christian art. And as soon as the devil appears in Christian art, then clergy specialists start to appear in the field of demonology. Okay. So in 1208, Pope Innocent III starts persecuting people. The first group he picks are the Cathars, and he says that they are heretics because they believe that God and Satan are competing with each other. Now, that if you say God and Satan are competing with each other, that means they're both equally powerful. So that makes you a heretic. But the thing that he really didn't like about the Cathars was that they were feminists. They were proto-feminists, and they actually had female clergy. And that was completely unacceptable because by now the religion had morphed into patriarchy. Okay. Okay, so by the 1300s, now witches are being called devil worshippers who had made a pact with Satan that gave them vast supernatural powers. As soon as they died, they would go straight to hell. Theologians become preoccupied with the idea that witches are in league with the devil. and that makes them a powerful adversary of the church. And that's what the clergy is worried about. Meanwhile, the people, the common people, all they're worrying about is, are the witches going to harm my animals? Are they going to steal my butter? Are they going to spoil my milk? Are they going to hurt my flocks? Are they going to hurt my cows? That's what people were worried about. Okay. And now they start persecuting the Knights Templar, who they accuse of Satanism, sorcery, sodomy, all kinds of things. And they start persecuting Jews, Waldensians, lepers, and homosexuals. They're all included with witches. The Waldensians, the church didn't like because they believed in apostolic poverty. You know how Jesus was telling his followers to give all their possessions to the poor and so on. Well, the Waldensians actually believed that. And so the church said they were heretics. Okay. Okay. So then, 1326, Pope John XXII launches the Inquisition. And now it's official dogma that you must prosecute witchcraft as a type of heresy. 1348 to 1350, the Black Death. And of course, you got to find somebody to blame. It's fascinating that, I mean, I haven't seen any references to COVID being caused by witches, which is interesting. That hasn't happened. 9/11 they accused witches of 9/11. I did see that, but I haven't seen anything about COVID. Anyway, so the Black Death happens, and now they say witches are spreading disease, eating children. That's kind of like QAnon, right? Cannibalizing children, worshiping Satan. And they also included Jews in there. So anti-Semitism and witchcraft are kind of melded together as equally bad. 1431, 100 years later, this is important. There was a council, it was called the Council of Basel, which was an anti-witch church council, where a bunch of theologians get together and standardize what they're going to believe about witches. And they create a witch stereotype. And then the people the men that attended that council go out and all over Europe, and they spread the message, and they're all saying the same thing. So now it becomes very standardized. And then the printing press gets invented in 1440. So their ideas are not just being disseminated by mouth. Now they have printed documents. So now it really takes off. Okay. It wasn't until 1475 when Johannes Nieder publishes Formicarius, where he says witches are predominantly uneducated women. Before that, they thought witches were so powerful and scary that they must all be highly trained men, mages, sorcerers, you know. So it wasn't until 1475. Now they're saying that they are women. And he says females are inferior physically, mentally, and morally, and therefore more susceptible to the devil. Mm-hmm. So now the commonest idea of witch, which we still have today in the general public, is the female. And that's when that happened. Okay. And then in 1484, Heinrich Kramer and Jakob Sprenger write a book called the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, and this becomes the new orthodoxy. And of course, it's spread like wildfire because of the invention of the Gutenberg press. And this is where the Hammer of Witches says you should strip the subjects naked, inspect them for witches' marks, like moles. If any of you has a mole, you're toast. Okay. Flea bites. If they stripped you naked and found flea bites, okay, I'm trying not to look at the questions. We're going to get to New England in a minute. Anyway, flea bites were considered witch marks. Okay, this is so sad. I mean, it's hard. It's really hard to think about this. But anyway, so in the mid 1500s, now the hysteria is really getting going. And of course, this is a complicated subject. It's not just religion. In the beginning, it was religion. It was the male clergy who were, upset about female goddesses. That was in the beginning. But I think one reason that it took off, the church could deflect blame. In other words, if Jesus was all powerful and God was all powerful, then how could disease happen? How could sickness happen? How could people be poor? How could the crops fail? So they had to have somebody to blame. That was part of it. But the other thing is, people were making money off of this. Everybody was making money. Judges got paid, lawyers got paid, the church got paid, the woodcutters who made the stakes to tie people to, who cut the wood for the bonfires, the smiths who made the metal shackles, the jailers. A witch had to pay for her own jailing, and she had to pay for the food that she ate and for being incarcerated. So there was money being made all along the line, there's so many reasons, that's just one more reason. Okay. So in the mid 1500s, now they start torturing and using the testimony of children to entrap witches. And under torture, the witches would name others, and then that caused it to spread. About 80% of the persecuted were women. Okay. And I'm just going, there's so much more. I'm just giving you a thumbnail. But in 1577, now Protestants begin to associate witchcraft with orgies, lewd, naked dancing, cannibalism, and infanticide, and a heresy, of course. And things are really, all over Europe, things are just getting worse and worse. So King James, the King James Bible, he publishes his own book called Demonology, which is a dissertation on necromancy, demonology, black magic, divination, and the reason that witches should be persecuted under canonical law. His book is a major inspiration for Shakespeare's Macbeth. Remember the three witches, double, double, toil and trouble.
Yeah.
James was terrified because he was caught in a massive storm at sea, and his fiancée was caught in a massive storm at sea. And so they, of course, blamed witches, because who else would cause a massive storm at sea? So the good news is around 1613, the last witch execution in Holland took place. So as usual, the Dutch were enlightened. Okay. In 1635, the Roman Inquisition admitted that they had found scarcely one trial conducted legally. And the nice thing about that is the Pope was actually trying to put a brake on things. The Pope was concerned that Catholics, good Catholics, were actually being accused and killed. And you can't have your parishioners being killed off, So the Pope was trying to put the brakes on, but things were in such a fever pitch, So 1647, we have Matthew Hopkins, who I'm sure you can talk about in Virginia, a failed lawyer who is called the Witch Finder General, wrote a famous book called The Discovery of Witches. And he and his buddies killed around 300 accused witches. They used forced confessions, examinations for witches' marks, warts, moles, insect bites, swimming tests where the accused witch would have her thumbs bound to her opposite big toe. She was thrown in the water. If she sank or drowned, she was pronounced innocent. If she floated, that was proof of guilt. He created all that. In 1693, the last witch in Denmark is killed. 1775, the last witch in France. 1782, the last witch in Switzerland. 1793, the last Polish execution. 1811, the last Prussian execution. 1951, the English Witchcraft Act is finally repealed, and later it was used to to go after spiritualists, tarot card readers, and gypsies, but not witches. And what's happening right now as we speak is Scotland is in the process of pardoning all the witches that were killed. And they're putting up a big monument. Okay, so, so
Wow.
2,000 years of history. So now the witch panic comes to New England. So the New Englanders, all they did was bring what they knew. They brought their European witch panic here. But the good thing is they got over it fairly quickly. It only took them, what?
Yeah, about 100 years.
100 years. So that was good. Okay, Virginia.
Thank you, Ellen. So the book that we're kind of revolving around this evening is The Real Witches of New England. That's probably backwards when I hold that up, by Evert Hopman. So if you are fascinated by all of that history, you can go much more into depth in her book. It really is amazing. But yes, the Puritans come over from there we go. The Puritans come over from England, and so we understand they've got a healthy tradition of hunting for witches. They've got a healthy fear of Satan, a healthy belief in the fact that bad things happen because of Satan and witches are embroiled in there. The times when there were actual panics were times when there was extra great fear. And I think probably as we look through even the European history, people believe in witches, they believe in Satan, they'll persecute witches, but these panics are when a perfect storm hits. And here in New England, for Connecticut, it was when there was plagues and crops are being ruined by all sorts of plague, and floods are overcoming the crops. There's sickness that's taking everyone. They're very afraid of the Native Americans, who they know are the devil incarnate. There's absolutely no question, because they're not Christian, that they are the devil. Times of great fear. But we will talk more about the New England panics on Tuesday with Richard Ross, when we are part of the Mary Barnes Society. In total, in New England, there were 93 official accusations. The first person to be hanged in Connecticut was Alice Young in Windsor, Connecticut. And the last people in Connecticut were Mary Barnes and Rebecca and Nathaniel Greensmith. Salem happened 30 years after our panic, and we had another small panic right after Salem. But in all, there were 93 cases of accusations, 50 in Massachusetts, 43 in Connecticut. 16 of those were put to death. And there's a lot of information that we'll be covering later on in the whole conversations and all of that. I do want to encourage you, and I see some people are doing it, feel free to throw your questions in the chat, and as we're talking, we'll address them and get to them at the end if we aren't able to get to them as we're going through all of this. But another thing that was very interesting is with the addition of the printing press, and it's almost like the internet, that was when people started being able to get the information, false and true information, easily. And you have to remember, the settlers here were not living in a vacuum. They were still very attached to England, to their places of birth. There was news, there were books, there were periodicals. So whatever was going on there in England was coming here. So they were mirroring a lot of that. They didn't come up with all of this. They did not invent how to persecute witches. They didn't invent the water test. They didn't invent all of this stuff. It came along with them. But yes, in Connecticut, witchcraft was a capital crime, and that was on the books until 1750, even though the last execution was in 1663. And really, we entered the age of enlightenment, and men and women of science, they began discovering that a lot of the evidence that was brought forward as evidence of witchcraft was actually natural, and therefore the persecutions and all of that died off, and we haven't seen that kind of witch persecution in quite a while. But there is a healthy, much more positive witch community alive and well today. And that's sort of where we want to get to now with Ellen. And she covers so much of this in this book. I love, she has interviewed descendants of some of the people who were executed or accused of witchcraft back in the 17th century. And that's fascinating to read all about them. But then you also are very involved with and know people who are practicing witchcraft right now. One of the questions I do want to just get, you yourself you're not a witch. And do I have this, you're a druid or you're a pagan? I might be confused on which that is. And I would love for you to clarify the difference between all of them.
Oh boy. Yeah.
And
I
nothing, no big dig, no big deal.
that is a huge subject. I am a druid, yes. And if you ask 3 druids what a druid is, you'll get 10 answers. If you ask 3 witches what a witch is, you'll get 20 answers. So to say what is the difference between a witch and a druid, again, you'll get many different answers. But I in my head, I've tried to distill it down to certain things. Witchcraft as it is practiced today, okay, I'm not talking about ancient times, because in ancient times, it was a craft, meaning that most of the practitioners, cunning men, wise women, were Christians. They went to church just like everybody else, but they knew this craft. So the craft is separate from the religion. But
Yes.
today, in modern times, it has become a religion for a lot of people. Probably most witches, it's their religion, because it's very goddess oriented, it's very moon oriented. And anytime you have holy days, special holy days, and you're worshiping a goddess, to me and you have a system of ethics, and it harm none,
Yeah.
or whatever you put out comes back 3 times, and that's a religion. And some people like to say it's not a religion, but it's a religion. It has holy days and so on. So, but witchcraft looks a little different than Druidism. Witches like to wear black. Here I am, I'm wearing black, which is confusing. Druids usually wear white, green, blue, or tartan, So Druids tend to do ritual more out in the sun, in the middle of the day. That's what we like to do, or dawn. We love doing dawn or dusk or midday. Witches tend to do things more at night. So witchcraft is a little more lunar. Druidism is a little more solar.
Okay.
And witchcraft, at least in the modern iteration, is duotheistic for many people. I'm not saying everybody.
Yes.
But for most people, it seems to be duotheistic, meaning all the goddesses are one goddess, all the gods are one god. And I mean, just about every witch circle I've ever attended, and I've attended many, it always comes down to that. So it doesn't really matter who you invoke, because it's an aspect of the goddess or an aspect of the god. Druidism is a little different, especially Celtic Reconstructionist Druidism, which is what I do. We are polytheists, hard polytheists, meaning that each deity is a separate personality for us. So we would never say that Bridget is the same thing as Kuan Yin. We just wouldn't do that, But to make things even more complicated, Druids recognize that we're part of the Indo-European spectrum. So the ancient Celtic religion is very similar to Hinduism. They both come from the Vedic tradition. And I'm writing a book right now that goes into all that. But so in the Vedic tradition, you have many gods and goddesses. You also have sacred cows, sacred horses, sacred fire, sacred water, sacred trees, all the stuff we have. But it all comes from source, right? It comes from the Atma. So we are monotheists and polytheists at the same time. We are also animists, because we find a soul or a spirit within trees, within rocks, within water, within fire, within animals, plants, herbs. So we're all those things, all at the same time.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about this, because none of this is new. I mean, people throughout the ages, in various countries throughout the world, everyone worships in a different way. But whether it's animism, mono, and I'm not a terribly high up on all of the different religions and all of that, but it all sounds familiar. there's nothing radical here. This is, as far as I'm concerned, it might be radical to a Christian perspective, but
Mhm.
in the history of the world, it's certainly not radical. Um,
No, I
uh,
mean, throughout most of human history, most humans, and I mean, we know that for at least 6,000 years, we've been polytheist. We've had gods and goddesses
yeah,
and,
sure.
rivers
Some
associated
galaxy
with certain
somewhere.
goddesses and
Sure.
mountains with certain gods. And, that's what humans have always done.
Exactly, all the peoples, exactly. So,
Yeah.
a question witches and Wiccan. That's often people put them together as you figure, oh, if somebody's a witch, they're Wiccan. Is that so, or are these two separate religions?
Oh boy, this is such a big topic. Somebody should write a book. No,
Yeah.
yeah, Wicca was invented in the 1930s by Gerald Gardner,
Okay.
and he had a lot of help. He had women around him actually who created his basic ritual form, which is probably the most popular ritual form now,
Mhm.
which is you get into a circle, you call in 4 directions, you invoke a goddess and a god, you raise a cone of power, you send out your intention, and then you reverse it. That comes from Gerald Gardner, and I always forget the woman's name. If somebody knows it, write it in the chat. But there was a woman actress, a female actress that he was working with who actually created the ritual form. So she should really get a lot of credit, because that's what just about every pagan gathering that you ever go to follows her form.
Uh-huh.
And he had, in the beginning, people like to say that he was, I'm talking about 30, 40 years ago, people were saying, oh, he was divinely inspired. He was part of this obscure coven in the New Forest of England and all that. But there's a great book by Ronald Hutton. It's called The Triumph of the Moon, which I highly recommend. He's a professor, a history professor at the University of Bristol, so he really knows his stuff. And he found 6 different versions of Gerald Gardner's Book of Shadows. So you can follow Gerald Gardner's thinking. And in the beginning, he was a typical patriarchal Christian trained, he thought the male witch, the priest, should be fully robed and surrounded by naked women. Okay. But
What
then,
fun for him.
yeah, by the end of his thought process, the priestess has become predominant, which is why it's called the Triumph of the Moon.
Okay.
And Wicca is actually just about the only, or one of the few religions in the world where women are predominant, and it's mostly priestesses now.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
that's Wicca. Wicca is a modern thing. It is not ancient Celtic religion, which a lot of people like to claim. It's
Right.
not historical. It has little bits of history thrown in, but it's a modern religion.
That's
Um,
great. Thank you.
yeah,
I was I should backtrack a little bit and just talk,
yeah.
with all of your knowledge. So, what exactly prompted you to write The Real Witches of New England? Where did that come from? It's a fascinating study, but what made you sit down and write a book?
Right. Well, when I write a book, obviously usually it takes a couple of years to write a book, although now that I'm quote unquote retired, it's taking a year maybe, but that's working. I work 7 days a week. I'm always working. But so I have to have a question. There has to be something that's absorbing, that's going to keep my attention, for 2 years typically. So I went to a coffee house, which sadly no longer exists, in Wendell, Massachusetts, called the Deja Brew Coffee House.
Brilliant.
And and I just went there. There was a poetry reading going on, so I just felt like listening to some live poetry. And a guy stands up, Michael Mowry, and he starts reading a poem about Mary Webster. And I've been living here in this part of New England. I live in Massachusetts, Western Mass. I've been living here for 30 years. I had never heard of a witch in my area. I knew that there were persecutions in Springfield,
Mhm.
which is about 45 minutes away if there's no traffic. But I had never heard that there was anybody local. And so he starts reading this poem, and I can read just a little bit of it to you. Mary Webster, You're poor, not rich. And so you stand barefoot, accused. Someone must be blamed. You are a witch. You're a witch. In times like these, because before your door you make hay carts tip and tumble of honest men on goodly errand, on the long slog of mud road that never drains through your dooryard in the darkened bend, because you make their horses balk and oxen cease to draw and ox carts shake and drovers' cattle spook, you make milk curdle and chimneys smoke and soap kettles boil over, and generally in wood or mowing, barnyard, hearthside or highway, you our Lord's good works suspend, upend, till good wives vexed curse and yeomen bedeviled hop in unholy rage from stone to stone with unchristian thought, with rod or switch to beat or whip. You're a witch. Yeah, so Mary Webster, I immediately, of course, grabbed him when he went to the bar for a drink, and I said, "What was that?" He said, "Oh yeah, Mary Webster, she's the witch of Hadley." I said, "What?" Because I was working in Hadley at the time. That was the place where I worked. And there's the old Hadley Cemetery.
Okay.
Was 5 minutes from where I worked, and I had no idea. I'd been there before. But Mary Webster was old. She was poor. She was a widow. And in those days, when you were a widow here in the colony, the church was responsible for your upkeep. If you didn't have a husband, especially if you had kids, and people resented that. And I think of it, I compare it to kind of ultra right-wing people who don't want people to have health care. They don't want people to have food stamps. Exactly that mentality. They just resented the fact that their tithes to the church would go to take care of poor women. Oh my God, So that was her problem. So they claimed that every time somebody tried to drive by her house with a cart, that the horses would stop and they wouldn't move. And the only way they could get the horses to move was they had to go into the house, beat her up. And when she was on the floor weeping or beaten, then all of a sudden the horses would move, or the ox cart would move. So that was, that was the accusation.
She's pretty much, her story is the story of the people accused in New England. Absolutely. The women, mostly women accused back in the history of New England. So what prompted you to then bring it into the modern age? What questions? I mean, there's the history of it, but you were already knowing part of the world, the current world, but then you went on to do the interviews and all of that.
Well, I just became really interested, because then I found out there were other witches here in this area. I didn't know that. And a lot of my friends are witches. Some of my best friends, in fact, my best friends are all witches. But
now, do you find that out by meeting at a coffee shop or by chatting? I think it's just, people don't talk about their religion a whole lot. Do witches talk about their religion?
No, it's interesting to me, because I see people online, and it blows my mind, because they say, "Oh, I'm living in this area and I can't find any pagans. I can't find any witches."
Oh.
And I'm like, "Oh my God," I don't know how that's even possible. But
you gotta be looking. Yeah.
They're not, I don't know what they're doing, but I mean, if you find a bookstore, a witch shop, a shop that has stones, an herb store,
that's where
see somebody, if you see somebody wearing a pentagram, look on a bulletin board in the library. Of course, now with COVID, it's not happening, but now there's no excuse. You just go online.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
And you just start Googling, or you go on Facebook and you put in witch or witches. And I mean, they're everywhere.
So if people are interested in exploring more, it's certainly easy to get to. I want to go back a little bit to, we were talking about the persecution of witches, and you even said we haven't seen a witch blamed for COVID yet. And I would, without getting political, I would posit right now, people who are blaming the Chinese, and I'm not even saying anything, but that's a bit of a witch hunt. That's an accusation.
Mhm.
These people made something bad happen, and we're always looking for someone to blame. Have you yourself ever experienced any kind of um, persecution or uh, what's the word? Um,
Okay, well, as a druid, I think the word druid is even more obscure to most people than the word witch. So I don't
Mm.
think people are not really frightened of druids the way they're frightened of witches. So I've kind of sailed under the radar. But I will tell you that in the back of my mind, because I know that my town that I live in, there are very rabid, right-wing, gun-toting, Bible-loving, you know, I mean, for real. I mean, they're fans of Sheriff Arpaio down, wherever he was from, and the Bundys, and they bring these people in to give talks at the local gun club, things like that. So I know enough to know that I don't want those people to catch on. The other half of my town is very progressive, very New England. It's the weirdest town. I mean, it's like the country. It's half and half. We have, the whole COVID wars. We have half the people who don't believe COVID is an issue, don't want their kids to wear masks, don't want to get vaccinated. The other half, the complete opposite. So I have tried, to keep a low profile. And so in the back of my mind, I do have fear.
Yeah.
I know that, but I haven't been persecuted because I've been kind of low key, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting. I know it's so easy to demonize people for various things. A lot of it comes from not understanding, which is why I'm so glad that we're doing this, that we're talking and coming to understand. I don't know that with all of our listeners we're preaching to the choir, but just seeing and hearing about a different way of worshiping and of thinking of the world. And I've got to think that in many ways the druid, the pagan, the Mother Earth worship would be a really healthy way for us to go. The respect for the earth and all of that is something that we all should be um, thinking more about and respecting and a little bit more.
Oh
to say,
yeah, especially now, with the climate
yeah,
disaster that is upon us, people need to see the sacredness of nature.
yeah, yeah,
And
exactly.
yeah, and then okay, so
Well, we do want to invite any questions
right,
that
I'm looking at the chat.
through.
Who
Exactly.
has a burning
A
question?
burning question. I do want to say, yes, disclaimer, and thank you, Andy. The views expressed here are not the views necessarily of the Stanley-Whitman House. We are having a wonderful chat here. Not meaning to be political or anything like that. But does anybody have questions? Just throw them on out there. I've asked a few of my own because I'm very intrigued by all of this. So you interviewed a number of different people who are practicing, I think, practicing witches now, and they all practice a different kind of witchcraft. And I was completely lost when I got to that part of your book because books and books probably can be read about each one of them. But
Mhm.
um, you also have to be schooled to become a witch. There's an official process, isn't there?
Yes, I mean it depends.
Okay.
Okay, so you have some people who read a book and they say, "Oh, I read this book. I'm a witch," they say that. And you see the same thing with druids. Somebody reads a book or they see a movie
Mhm.
and they go, "I'm a druid," Whereas in ancient times, the druids spent 20 years learning how to be a druid, you know. So you have witches who are part of a lineage, especially the traditional Gardnerian witch lineage, and they know who they were trained by and they know which lineage they are in, and they take years. You have to hang out with a coven for a year and a day before they will even consider whether you are eligible for training. And they're
Okay.
very serious. There's a lot of stuff you have to learn and do. And it's the same thing. There are Druid groups. My group is called Tribe of the Oak.
Mhm.
There are Druid groups that require a lot of reading. We have about 18 books that people have to read before they can even start their one-on-one fostering. We call it fostering. And most people these days, it's really interesting. I've been doing this for 30 years or more.
Yeah.
And I've been teaching people for a long time. But what I notice now is it's harder and harder for people to read the books, which I find fascinating.
Mm.
They just don't want to do it.
Huh.
They-
Oh, well, and I mean, why you have to have a full understanding of what you're embarking upon.
Of
So,
course, yeah,
yeah.
but there's something has happened. I think it's because of the internet,
Yeah.
and people want the information. Well, the way we're doing now, I've had people tell me, you should take the books and you should make tapes, like we're doing now, of each book, and
Yeah.
then people can watch the videotape, and
Yeah.
and they want to do that, but they don't want to read the book, which means I have to go back and reread all the books and create I mean, no, thank you. I'm just not willing to do that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, but so anyway, so I don't know how we got onto this, but there's witches and there's witches and there's druids and there's druids,
Yeah.
and everybody's different. Okay, do you think that any of the accused witches in New England?
Yeah. We have some great descendants. on.
Right. Most of the accused witches in New England were Christians, as far as I can tell. They were not, they were accused witches.
Mhm.
And what I always find interesting is Tituba is the only one that I've ever seen who looked like she was actually practicing a kind of folk magic, and she
Right.
wasn't killed.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, she's such an interesting person in that when everybody knows about the Salem witch hunts. That's what's very famous.
Yeah, none of those people were witches.
None of those people were
None of them.
practicing witchcraft. Yeah, so there's theories about that, but uh, that was the only instance where there was someone like Tituba from a different belief system who came in and could have had any influence. So people look at Salem and they say that's what it was like in New England. That's what happened in New England. When actually in New England, people were regularly accused, tried, hanged along the way, and then you had your pockets of your panics. But Tituba in the Salem story changes the narrative in many ways, which people don't appreciate. What that situation was not what was happening in general New England, but that's off-roading a little bit. Someone has a question about Mary Barnes, and I think
Oh, that's
she
for you.
was, yes, one of the one of the last people, along with Rebecca and Nathaniel Greensmith, to be hanged for witchcraft. We know that she was hanged, but not much is written about her. And so, no, we don't. We do know that Thomas did end up marrying Mary Andrews after Mary was hanged. Um, at the Stanley-Whitman house, we had developed a play, The Witchcraft Trial of Mary Barnes, and gave us some poetic license, because there's not a lot of factual history about her, that we were able to bring her experience, give her experience that's drawn from many others. But yeah, she's a tragic character, I think, because she never spoke up for herself. There's not much recorded. We don't really know why, but we do know that she was hanged. Let's see. So let's see. We know. Yes, Mary was hanged with Rebecca and Nathaniel Greensmith. Exactly. So, do all druids have healing powers? That's a question. Bring us back to the 21st century.
Well, it depends on their training. Again, I know druids who are naturopaths. I myself am an herbalist. There are a number of druid herbalists. You got to have training. You don't just automatically have healing powers because you're a druid. It doesn't happen like that.
Yeah.
So it's just like anybody else. You got to be trained.
And there's probably a natural affinity, just as everyone. I mean, which even goes back to the women who are being accused. They were the healers.
The
They were the
midwives.
ones. The midwives, yes, they were there when people were born, and they were there when people died, and sometimes that was at the exact same time. Um, often in the places where it was easy to blame them, to say the least, the ones that were doing the cooking. Um, yeah,
Well,
it's
also when the male medical profession took off, because it was traditionally women and grandmothers who were doing the healing work.
sure.
Um, but when the medical profession became a profession, they wouldn't allow women. They wouldn't allow women into the medical schools. And if you couldn't go to the medical school, you couldn't practice medicine. So who was their competition? It was the midwives
Yeah.
and the herbalists. Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely the patriarchal society, and I love men, don't get me wrong, but they wrote the books and they shoved the women out. One of the theories I also from the Bible, because a woman was made from Adam's rib, she was weaker, so there was no way she could possibly deflect the devil and his advances. But lots of different theories, a lot of different information there. I'm looking through for any more questions that people might have. Tony Griego, who's with us, and I've known Tony for quite a while. Welcome, Tony. His question: why hasn't Connecticut officially acknowledged its role in colonial witch hunts? We're the only state who hasn't. You mentioned Scotland. Scotland did do some sort of a
Right now, they're in the
Pardon?
process of, there was a huge campaign. People have to launch the campaign. It doesn't just
Yeah.
automatically happen.
Yeah.
So people in Scotland, they had petitions, they asked the government, and now finally all the witches are being pardoned and they're putting up monuments in their honor. And that's right now happening.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you want Connecticut witches to be pardoned, you have to petition the government,
And I do believe that that's happened, certainly, and it hasn't been. They haven't been terribly receptive. I mean, there's an idea that well, they say, well, when this was all happening, we weren't Connecticut, we were England, so it's not our fault. And England saying, well, we're not going to worry about that because that was too long ago. So I
Well,
know that it's
you
been
could use
ongoing.
what's happening in Scotland, you could use that
Yeah,
as a precedent. If you were part of England, Scotland is
that's true.
part of
Yeah,
Britain.
yeah. So it's an ongoing uh, effort, I guess, and consideration to say the least. It's funny. I have my one woman show on the Connecticut Witchcraft Panics, and I go into schools quite often and try to let kids know that, as we've talked about, when this happened, they weren't a bunch of wackos. They really were, in many instances, thinking that finding a way to protect their community. When bad things happen, well, if we find why it's happening, we find the witch who's working with the devil to make such and such happen, then our community will be safe. Not having the science that we have now, not understanding whether not having, future cast on the news and knowing about
We still do the same thing, though. As you said, we blame the Chinese for a
yes,
virus.
yeah,
I mean, the persecution of women is picking up again, from what I can see. I mean, if you look at what's happening in Texas, you have half the country apparently believes that women don't have the brains to manage their own lives, and so male politicians have to make up their mind for them and tell them when they can be pregnant and when they can have a family, and that no woman is capable of figuring that out. So it's happening all over again.
yeah. I think it's always been happening with someone, but oh my gosh. So moving forward, I know that we'll have Ellen back because her specialty is not just witches, but she'll be part of the conversation club on April 21st. The Sacred Herbs of Spring, Magical, Edible, and Healing Plants to Celebrate Beltane, which is wonderful. And I do want to tie in, sort of backtracking again, all of our programs are kind of around the different Celtic festivals. Do I have that right? I mean, these festivals are the biggest ones. And I know you said that there's one that we're close to today, and I completely forget the name of it.
Imbolc.
Yes.
Yeah,
Tell
Imbolc.
us a little bit about that.
Okay, so February 1st and 2nd, starts February 1st, starts the evening of the 1st and goes to the 2nd. It's a festival of Bridget. and she's both a goddess and a saint because she was a goddess originally, and in Ireland they couldn't give up Bridget. She was too important. So then they said she was the Mary of the Gale, and somehow she was in Bethlehem when Jesus was born.
Okay.
This Irish woman was in Bethlehem. So she becomes the Mary of the Gale. And then there's a Saint Bridget, and the stories of the goddess and the saint are kind of all morphed together. And there was a fire temple that was the goddess Bridget's fire temple, and then it became Saint Bridget's fire temple. And apparently there was a nun who took over and continued the practice. So there were nuns who were managing this fire temple, and Imbolc is a fire festival. But this temple was a place where the people would come with questions, and originally it was priestesses who would scry. They would look into the fire and get the answer, and then it was nuns. And then, of course, when the Pope found out this was going on, he put a stop to it.
Right.
But again, Bridget is so popular that nobody could give her up, and so now it's Saint Bridget. And on that night she comes by, and you can, if you have a cloak, like for example, I have this cape on, right? I have one, not this one, but I have one that I use for healing. So in other words, if I'm sick or if somebody else is sick, they can wear the special cloak. So at Imbolc at night, I'll put it out, and there's usually snow on the ground, but I put it out, and Bridget comes by and she blesses it, and it can be used all year.
Oh my. So
Yeah.
it's fascinating. It's great. So yes, the next 3 programs that we'll have with Ellen are based around other festivals. On April 21st, the Sacred Herbs. On July 21st, Secret Medicines from Your Garden. And on October 20th, the Sacred Herbs of
Samhain.
Salem. Thank you.
Samhain.
I'm going to have to do a lot of practicing. And what's so exciting is the Stanley-Whitman house has a fabulous garden where I think all of the herbs and the things that you'll be talking about are to be found, most probably. So we'll look forward to all of that. Now, any other questions before we do have to wrap this up? I'm just looking through to make sure that this is interesting. I'm not aware of this trend. How would you feel about the big wave of teen witches that are turning witchcraft into a trend with social medias? Which you can turn anything into a trend with social medias. So I'm sure it must be out there. Have you been affected by that, or?
Well, I haven't, but I've certainly discussed it with witches, people that I consider real witches, who they're somewhat dismayed because there's a lot of incorrect information. In fact, just yesterday, I was talking to somebody about this, that apparently there's somebody on TikTok who is telling people how to bring fairies into your house. What's really interesting is, and I of course, I have a book called Scottish Herbs and Fairy Lore that I've written. But if you're in Ireland or in Scotland, right, you do everything possible to not let them into the house, you know. That's the last thing you want, because if they get into the house, they cause all kinds of mischief, you know. And that's in many traditions. The Greeks have in the book that I just wrote, The Sacred Herbs of Christmas and Yule, which isn't out yet, but the Greeks will put hyssop into the fire, and if that doesn't work, they'll put old shoes into the fire. And what's interesting is in Scotland, they use juniper, and if that doesn't work, they use leather, a strip of leather, which is the same thing as old shoes, but that's to keep them, that's to get them out, you know. And the last thing you want to be doing is, so there's really crazy misinformation floating around on TikTok and on the web, you know. So I mean, if you're really serious about this, you need a teacher. You can't just learn it on TikTok. You know. You need a teacher.
I know. That's and the internet can only make this more complicated. So
we live in interesting times.
We do, but I think everybody would say that they did. But talking like this gives us a real perspective, you know, of our world, where we came from, where we are, where we may be going. So I really appreciate the expertise and the knowledge you bring of the history of all of this. So
Okay, so
again,
somebody's asking a link. If you go to my website, elleneverthopman.com, there should be links there. If you're interested in Druidism, you can go to tribeoftheoak.com. And you can also just Google my name, because
yes.
there's stuff floating around on Yahoo and Facebook. If I have a Facebook author page, I have at least one talk posted up there. I'm all over the place.
You are all over the place, but you are, I will say, a fountain of knowledge. The Real Witches of New England, that just fascinating stuff. Yes. So if this has piqued anybody's interest, and isn't that funny, because you got involved with this by all of a sudden finding out that there was a woman accused of witchcraft you weren't even aware of. I was born in Salem, Massachusetts, and it's through
Right.
Stanley-Whitman house I heard about Mary Barnes, and I realized that Connecticut, was the first place. So becoming part of history, understanding the history and all of that is very exciting. So there's a lot of history in the Real Witches of New England. So I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. We're right at about 5 o'clock, so I'm so proud of us for keeping this together. You can reach Ellen if you have further questions, or we won't cut you out right immediately. But if you have a couple of other questions you want to come in, but if you're interested in this, there's a lot of good information out there. Don't trust the internet for whatever you might be looking for. There's a lot of published books, a lot of experts, really good information, and nice way to open our eyes. Thank you so much, Ellen.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. And we'll hopefully see you see you. I hope that many of you will join us on Tuesday for the Mary Barnes Society chat with Richard Ross, who's got another fascinating book about the history of the New England witchcraft panics, and then the future programs with Ellen. Thank you.